somewhere out there it is very late. Maybe the room around you has gone quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet only after midnight. The hum of the day finally switched off, the mind finally given permission to stop holding so many things at once. If you are lying down, good. If your eyes are already heavy, even better. Nothing that follows needs your full attention. It only needs your company, the way an old story needs someone willing to listen to it slowly. Because tonight we are going somewhere far from this room. We are going back almost exactly 900 years, to a city built on a hill of pale stone, where the streets still smelled faintly of dust and incense and horses, and where, in the autumn of the year 1119, 9 tired men made a promise to each other that none of them could have known would outlive their names. They had almost nothing, no land, no fortune, no formal blessing from Rome. What they had was a single quiet idea that the roads leading into a holy city had become too dangerous for the ordinary pilgrims who walked them, and that someone, anyone, should be willing to stand between the innocent and the danger. So they did, and in doing so, without quite meaning to, they began one of the strangest, richest, and most quietly haunting stories in all of history. The story of the Knights Templar, warrior monks who would rise from nothing to become the most feared soldiers and the wealthiest bankers of their age, and who would then, on a single autumn morning nearly 200 years later, seem to vanish almost overnight, as though the earth itself had simply closed back over them. There is something about that particular ending, the suddenness of it, the way an order that had stood for nearly 200 years could seem to disappear within the span of a single coordinated morning, that has kept people quietly turning this story over in their minds for more than 7 centuries since. It is not a story of a slow fade, the kind that happens to most old institutions worn down gradually by time and irrelevance. It is a story that begins in painstaking patience, spends 2 centuries building something vast and lasting, and then closes, quite abruptly, in a single sweep of sealed letters and dawn arrests. We will take our time getting there tonight, the way this kind of story deserves, wandering slowly through 200 years before we ever reach that final autumn morning. There is no need to rush toward the ending. The ending will still be there, waiting quietly, whenever we arrive. You do not need to remember any of this. You do not need to hold on to a single date or name. Just let the story move past you the way clouds move past a window, close enough to notice, far enough not to disturb you. Somewhere in the middle of it, your eyes will likely close, and that is exactly as it should be. History, after all, has always been better heard than studied, and there is no better hour for it than this one. Let us begin gently, where they began, in Jerusalem, in the cool blue hour just after dawn. The city in 1119 was not the Jerusalem of postcards or paintings. It was smaller, rougher, still catching its breath after the violence of 20 years earlier, when armies from Western Europe had marched across an entire continent and taken the city by force during what history would later call the First Crusade. That crusade had ended in 1099, and in the 2 decades since, a fragile new kingdom had grown up around the captured city, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, ruled first by a nobleman named Godfrey of Bouillon, and by 1119 by a king named Baldwin II, a practical, weathered man who had inherited a crown balanced on the edge of a knife. Because holding Jerusalem, it turned out, was an entirely different problem from taking it. Word had spread across Europe that the holy places, the sites where Christian pilgrims believed their faith had been born, were open again, and so pilgrims came. Not soldiers, not knights, but ordinary people. Farmers, merchants, elderly men and women who had saved for years for the journey, entire families walking for months across unfamiliar land, all converging on roads that wound through narrow mountain passes, an open desert between the port city of Jaffa and the gates of Jerusalem itself. Those roads were not safe. The kingdom's small standing army was stretched thin trying to defend actual territory, and it had little strength left over to escort every traveller along every mile of exposed road. Bandits knew this, so did opportunistic raiders. There are accounts from that period, quiet, almost bureaucratic in tone, the way official records often are, describing pilgrims found along the road to Jerusalem, their belongings gone, having never reached the city they had crossed a continent to see. One especially sombre account describes as many as 300 pilgrims killed on that road in a single year, with hundreds more taken captive. Whether the precise number was exactly that or somewhat different, historians agree the danger was real, constant, and widely known. It was into this gap, this quiet, unglamorous, deeply human problem, that a French knight named Jacques de Molay stepped. We do not know a great deal about his early life. He came from the region of Champagne, in what is now northeastern France, and he had likely already taken part in earlier crusading campaigns before settling in the Holy Land. What we do know is that sometime around 1119, he approached King Baldwin II with an unusual proposal, brought alongside a small handful of companions, usually numbered at 8, making 9 founders in total, though the records from this earliest period are thin enough that historians hold even that number gently, as a likely rather than a certain fact. Their proposal was this: they would form a small brotherhood of knights, bound not by the usual codes of feudal loyalty, but by monastic vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, and they would dedicate themselves entirely to protecting pilgrims on the roads to Jerusalem. Not for payment, not for land, for the simple, almost old-fashioned reason that it needed doing, and no one else was doing it. Baldwin agreed, and in a gesture that would quietly shape the rest of the order's identity, he gave the new brotherhood quarters inside the royal palace, which stood on the Temple Mount, on or very near the site where medieval Christians believed the ancient Temple of Solomon had once stood. The building the knights actually occupied was, in reality, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, repurposed after the Crusader conquest. But to European eyes and imaginations at the time, the association with Solomon's Temple was what mattered. And so the small brotherhood took a new name for itself, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. In time, the world would shorten that long, humble name into something easier to say, the Knights Templar. But in those first years, there was very little that looked like the legend to come. There were only a handful of men, living in genuine poverty, sharing what little they had, sleeping in a converted mosque on a hill in a half-secured kingdom, riding out along dangerous roads to walk beside strangers who had nothing to offer them but gratitude. It is worth pausing, just for a moment, on what that journey actually meant to the people making it, because the danger only makes sense once you understand the depth of longing that made people risk it in the first place. A pilgrim setting out from a village in Burgundy or the English Midlands in this period might spend the better part of a year simply reaching the eastern Mediterranean, travelling by foot, by cart, by whatever passing ship would carry them, bringing letters of introduction, a little coin, and very often a quiet, private grief or hope they had told almost no one about, a prayer for a dead child, a vow made during a long illness, a simple desire to stand once, in the place where their entire understanding of the world had supposedly begun. For such a traveller, the final approach to Jerusalem, cresting a last dry hill, and seeing the city's pale walls catch the late afternoon light for the first time, was very often the single most overwhelming moment of an entire lifetime. Surviving accounts describe pilgrims weeping openly at first sight of the city, some sinking to their knees in the road, entirely unconcerned with how far they still had left to walk. It was this fragile, hard-won, deeply personal moment that the Templars had quietly appointed themselves to protect. Not an abstract cause, but this exact kind of ordinary human longing, multiplied across thousands of anonymous travellers a year. There is a detail from this earliest period that historians find easy to believe precisely because it is so unglamorous. The order was so poor in its founding years that its seal, adopted later, showed 2 knights riding on a single horse. Some later writers took this as a symbol of humility, 2 brothers sharing what little they had. Others suggest it may simply have reflected the plain, practical truth that in the beginning there were not enough horses to go around. Perhaps both readings are true at once. History rarely insists on a single meaning when 2 gentler ones will do. Of the 8 men who are traditionally remembered as standing beside Jacques de Molay in that founding moment, history has kept hold of only a few names with any real confidence. There was Godfrey de Saint-Omer, a knight from Flanders, often named as the Brotherhood's second founder. A handful of others are recorded only in fragments, a name here, a passing mention there. In charters and chronicles written by men who had no idea, at the time, that they were writing down the beginnings of something the world would still be talking about 9 centuries later. It is worth remembering, gently, that this is simply how most beginnings actually look from the inside. No trumpets, no sense of history being made, just a handful of tired men agreeing to try something, because trying seemed better than doing nothing at all. Their daily work, in those early years, would have looked almost unremarkable to an outside observer. A small mounted patrol, perhaps 6 or 8 men, riding out from the Temple Mount along the road toward Jaffa, moving at the pace of the pilgrims they were escorting, rather than the pace they might have preferred. The road climbed and dropped through pale limestone hills, past dry riverbeds and small stands of olive and terebinth trees, offering countless places where a hidden group of raiders could wait unseen until the column had passed too far to easily retreat. The knights would have known every blind curve, every outcrop of rock, the way a person comes to know the layout of a room they walk through in the dark. There was no glory in this work, not in any way that would have been recognized by the wider knightly culture of the period, which still prized tournaments, single combat, and dramatic feats of individual heroism. This was slower, quieter, more like a shepherd's vigilance than a warrior's ambition. And perhaps that too is part of why the story still feels worth telling so many centuries later, because it began not with a hunger for glory, but with the comparatively rare decision to do something patient and unglamorous, simply because it was needed. For nearly a decade, the Brotherhood remained small, known mostly to the kingdom around them, quietly patrolling the roads, quietly protecting the vulnerable, quietly building a reputation that had not yet reached the wider world. That would soon change, and when it would change because of one man's voice, a monk in France whose words could apparently move armies and popes alike. His name was Bernard, abbot of a monastery called Clairvaux, and by the late 1120s he was arguably the single most influential religious figure in all of Western Christendom. He had spent his life shaping the direction of monastic reform, and he happened, as it turned out, to be a relative of one of the original 9 founders. When Hugues de Payens travelled back to Europe around 1127 to seek formal recognition for the small order and to recruit new members, it was Bernard who took up their cause. In January of 1129, a church council convened in the French town of Troyes, and there, with Bernard's support carrying real weight in the room, the Knights Templar received official recognition from the Catholic Church. A formal rule of life was drawn up for them, hundreds of specific regulations governing everything from how they should pray, to how they should dress, to how many horses a knight was permitted, to how they should conduct themselves at meals, in battle, and in silence. It was, in effect, the moment a small improvised brotherhood became a formally sanctioned religious and military order, answerable in the end only to the Pope himself rather than to any king or bishop. Bernard did something else too. He wrote an essay in praise of this strange new invention, men who were fully warriors and fully monks at once, a combination that troubled some churchmen who felt that killing, even in a just cause, sat uneasily beside a life of prayer. Bernard's answer, in the simplest possible terms, was that a knight who killed in defense of the innocent, free from personal hatred or greed, committed what he called not homicide, but malicide, the killing of evil itself rather than of a person. It was a controversial argument even in its own time, but it gave the Templars something enormously valuable, a moral framework in which their entire existence made sense. They were not soldiers seeking glory. They were not monks retreating from the world. They were something new, protectors who had simply decided that prayer alone was not enough to keep pilgrims safe, and that swords alone were not enough to keep a soldier's soul at peace, and that perhaps, held together carefully, the two could support each other. From that same council came the image most people still associate with them today, even if they know nothing else about the order: the plain white mantle. White was chosen deliberately as a symbol of purity worn over simple undeyed wool. The now famous red cross, stitched over the heart or across the shoulder, would not be formally granted until 1147, when Pope Eugenius III authorized it ahead of the Second Crusade, giving the Templars a visual mark that made them instantly recognizable on any battlefield in Christendom, a small design choice that would end up, quietly, becoming one of the most enduring images in European history. Let your breathing settle here for a moment if it hasn't already. There is no test at the end of this. Only more story, unfolding slowly, the way it always does when there is nowhere else you need to be. Before we continue further into their story, I want to pause, just briefly, the way an old friend might pause mid-sentence to check that you're comfortable. If this kind of slow, cinematic history is the sort of thing that helps you unwind at the end of a long day, it would mean a great deal if you tapped the like button, and if you're new here, consider staying a while longer by subscribing to the Driftorian. It costs nothing, and it helps this particular kind of quiet storytelling find its way to other tired minds like yours. And if you'd like, before you drift too far, you're welcome to leave a small word in the comments, where in the world you're listening from tonight, or what time it is where you are. There is something oddly comforting in knowing that somewhere else, in some other time zone, another stranger is doing exactly what you're doing right now, lying still, letting history carry them towards sleep. Now, back to Jerusalem, and to the slow, steady growth of an order that was about to become far larger than anyone in that first small room could have imagined. Once the Templars had the church's formal blessing, something changed almost immediately. Donations began arriving, not just coins, but land, castles, farms, mills, entire villages, given by noble families across France, England, Spain, Portugal, and the Italian city-states, often by men preparing to go on crusade themselves, who wished to leave something behind that would fund the defense of the holy places, even if they themselves never returned. Within a single generation, the tiny brotherhood that had once shared horses out of necessity had become the beneficiary of one of the largest waves of religious philanthropy in medieval European history. This created an unusual and, in hindsight, quite elegant problem. The Order's entire purpose was rooted in the Holy Land, roughly 2,000 miles from most of these new estates in Western Europe. So the Templars built what amounted to an entire second organization back home. A vast network of properties called preceptories, or commanderies, scattered across nearly every kingdom in Western Christendom. Each of these functioned partly as a working farm or estate, partly as a local chapter of the Order, and partly as a support base whose entire purpose was to generate income and resources that could be sent eastward, to fund the knights actually fighting and guarding pilgrims in the Holy Land. It is worth sitting with the scale of this for a moment, not because the numbers matter for their own sake, but because they help explain everything that followed. By the Order's height in the 13th century, historians estimate the Templars maintained somewhere in the range of 900 to 1,000 of these properties, scattered across Europe and the Levant, staffed by a combination of knights, non-noble sergeants, chaplains, and a very large number of lay workers, craftsmen and farm labourers who were not full members of the Order at all, but who lived and worked on Templar land. Only a relatively small fraction of the Order's total membership, likely well under 1 in 10, were the mounted, sword-bearing knights of popular imagination. The rest were the quiet infrastructure that made those knights possible at all. The shepherds, the vintners, the millers, the scribes, the stewards, the ship captains. Some of these European holdings became well known in their own right, quite apart from the Order's activities in the Holy Land. In London, the Templars built a round church modelled on the rotunda of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, its circular nave still standing today along the river, a quiet echo of Jerusalem transplanted into an English riverbank. In the countryside of southwestern France, the Order came to hold substantial vineyards, their wine shipped and traded across Europe. In England and in parts of Spain, Templar estates ran considerable flocks of sheep, feeding into the wool trade that was at the time one of the most lucrative industries in the whole of Western Europe. None of this was incidental. Every barrel of wine sold, every measure of wool traded, every harvest brought in from a Templar field in Normandy or Aragon, fed back into the same slow, patient river of resources that kept castles standing and garrisons fed 2,000 miles away. Because managing an operation of that size across such enormous distances required something else entirely. Not swords, but paperwork, trust, and an extraordinarily reliable system for moving value from one place to another. And here the story takes a turn that surprises most people the first time they hear it. Long before modern banks existed in anything like their current form, the Knights Templar had, almost by accident, invented something remarkably close to one. Picture a pilgrim in the year, say 1180, a merchant from Lyon perhaps, preparing to travel to Jerusalem, carrying a heavy purse of gold coin across 2,000 miles of road, through mountain passes and pirate-haunted sea lanes, was an open invitation to disaster. So instead, that pilgrim could walk into a Templar preceptory near his home, deposit his money there, and receive in exchange a sealed letter of credit, a document, essentially, confirming the deposit and identifying the traveller. He could then journey east, carrying nothing more valuable than a folded piece of parchment, and upon arriving at a Templar house in Jerusalem, present that letter and withdraw the equivalent sum in local currency, minus a modest fee for the service. It was, in essence, an early form of the traveller's check, centuries before the concept had a name, built entirely on the order's reputation for honesty, and the near impossibility of forging their elaborate seals and coded record-keeping. Kings borrowed from the Templars. Noble families stored their treasure with them for safekeeping, the way a modern family might use a safety deposit box. The Paris Temple, the Order's grand fortified headquarters in the French capital, complete with its own towers, chapel, and treasury, effectively functioned for long stretches of the 13th century as the royal treasury of France itself, with Templar officials keeping the crown's accounts. Behind that trust sat a genuinely sophisticated system of record-keeping. Templar accountants used detailed ledgers, careful cross-referencing between houses, and, according to some historians, cipher systems for encoding sensitive financial information, making the order's paperwork remarkably difficult to forge or falsify. A letter of credit issued at a preceptory in Champagne could be verified, checked, and honoured at a Templar house in Acre months later, by brothers who had never met the depositor, simply because the systems of trust and documentation behind it were considered, by the standards of the age, essentially unimpeachable. It is a strange thing to realise, lying quietly in the dark tonight, that some of the earliest architecture of modern banking, the idea that a promise written on paper could be trusted more than the coin in your pocket, was built not by merchants or moneylenders, but by monks who had sworn a vow of poverty. There is something quietly moving in this, if you let yourself sit with it. A brotherhood that began with 9 men sharing horses because they could not afford enough for each of them, within 2 generations, had become so trusted with the movement of wealth that kings placed their treasuries in Templar hands. Poverty and prosperity, sitting side by side in the very same institution, the individual knight still bound by his vow to own almost nothing personally, even as the order around him grew wealthier than most kingdoms. That contrast, in fact, was written directly into the order's daily life. A Templar knight, on entering the order, surrendered his personal possessions entirely. His clothing, his weapons, even his horse technically belonged to the order rather than to him. He slept in a shared dormitory, ate in communal silence while a designated brother read aloud from scripture, and lived by a schedule built almost entirely around prayer, rising in the dark hours before dawn for the first service of the day, and returning to formal prayer again and again as the hours passed. The rhythm of monastic life folded around the rhythm of military duty like 2 currents moving through the same river. The rule agreed upon at Troyes, later expanded across the decades that followed into hundreds of individual clauses, governed almost everything. A knight's hair was to be cut short, without ornament. His beard, in the order's early decades, was to be worn long and unshaven, distinguishing Templars visually from most other European knights of the period, who favoured a clean-shaven look. Excess in food was frowned upon, meat was restricted on most days of the week, gambling was forbidden. Idle conversation, particularly anything resembling boasting about past battles, was actively discouraged, on the reasoning that pride had no place in a brotherhood built around humility. Even something as small as owning a lock for one's own chest was regulated. A knight might keep private letters there, but the order reserved the right to inspect the contents at any time, since nothing, in principle, truly belonged to him alone. And yet, this was not a soft or gentle order in any conventional sense. Templar knights trained constantly, and in battle they became known. Even among enemies who otherwise had little reason to praise Crusader forces as extraordinarily disciplined fighters. Where other medieval cavalry sometimes broke formation in the heat of combat, chasing individual glory or fleeing at the first sign of danger, Templar Knights were bound by their rule to hold their line, to never retreat unless formally ordered to by a commander, and to never surrender while a banner of the order still stood upright on the field. Muslim chroniclers of the period, writing about the various armies they faced across 2 centuries of conflict in the Levant, repeatedly singled out the Templars and their fellow military order, the Knights Hospitaller, as the most feared and most disciplined of all the Crusader forces, an assessment that historians on both sides of the story have found to hold up remarkably well. This discipline was reflected even in something as simple as the order's structure of ranks. At the very top stood the Grand Master, elected for life by the order's senior members, a figure who answered, in matters of the rule, only to the Pope himself, a remarkable degree of independence in an era when almost every other institution in Europe was tangled in webs of feudal loyalty to some local king or lord. Beneath the Grand Master sat a seneschal, a kind of deputy commander, and beneath him regional masters overseeing the order's holdings in specific kingdoms, a master of France, a master of England, a master of Aragon, and so on. Each individual preceptory, meanwhile, was overseen by its own local commander, called a preceptor, who managed everything from the estate's farming operations to the discipline of the brothers living there. Beneath the knights themselves, who were required, under the rule, to be of noble birth, served the sergeant brothers, drawn from non-noble families, who made up the majority of the order's fighting strength and wore simple brown or black mantles rather than the knight's distinctive white, a visual hierarchy that mirrored the rigid social structures of the wider medieval world, even inside an institution built around humility. And beneath the sergeants still, chaplains tended to the order's spiritual life, hearing confessions and celebrating Mass for brothers who, under their vows, were largely cut off from the ordinary parish life most medieval Christians took for granted. Joining the order at all was itself a formal, almost solemn undertaking, governed by its own careful ritual. A candidate, usually a young nobleman, sometimes a widower or an older knight, seeking to spend his remaining years in service rather than idle retirement, would be brought before a chapter of assembled brothers behind closed doors. He would be asked, according to surviving versions of the ceremony, a long series of searching questions. Whether he was already married, whether he owed debts he could not repay, whether he had made any secret promise to join another order, whether he was suffering from any hidden illness. He would be warned, plainly and repeatedly, that once he entered, he would never again be free to leave of his own will, that he would give up his own body, so to speak, to become the servant of another. Only if he affirmed again and again that he understood and freely accepted these terms would he be brought back into the chapter room, made to kneel, and formally received into the brotherhood, the white mantle placed over his shoulders for the first time. It was, in its own quiet way, a kind of death and rebirth, the surrender of one entire life in exchange for another, simpler one, built around obedience, discipline, and purpose. These ceremonies, and the regular chapter meetings that governed the order's internal affairs, were conducted entirely behind closed doors, with guards posted outside to ensure no outsider, and no brother below the appropriate rank, could listen in. This was, in its own time, an entirely ordinary practice among monastic orders, most of which kept their internal deliberations private for the same simple reasons any institution might, to allow for honest correction of a brother's faults without public humiliation, and to preserve a certain dignity around vows and disciplines that were considered sacred rather than merely administrative. But secrecy, however innocent its origin, tends to invite curiosity from those left standing outside the door, and across the decades, the closed nature of Templar gatherings quietly fed a low, persistent undercurrent of gossip and speculation in the wider world beyond the order's walls. Rumours about what exactly was said, sworn, or shown to a man in the moment he became a brother of the temple. For most of the order's history, this curiosity remained little more than idle talk, the ordinary murmuring any powerful private institution attracts. It would not remain so idle forever, though that part of the story belongs to a later hour of the night. It is easy, hearing all of this, to imagine the Templars as a purely military institution, with a religious veneer laid thinly over the top. but that would miss something important about how genuinely, deeply devotional their daily existence actually was. Consider a single ordinary day at a Templar house somewhere in the Holy Land during the 12th century. Not a day of battle, simply a day of living. The brothers would rise while the sky was still black, gathering in near darkness for the office of matins, their voices low, the chapel lit by a handful of candles. They would return to sleep for a short while afterward, then rise again at first light for prime. Through the day that followed, the canonical hours would come and go like a slow, steady tide. Terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline, each one calling the brothers back to prayer, whatever else they had been doing in between, whether mending harness leather, drilling with lance and sword in the practice yard, tending to the horses that were treated with almost as much care as the men themselves, or riding escort along a dusty road with a column of nervous pilgrims trailing behind them. The rule was equally specific about the tools of a knight's calling, in ways that reveal how carefully even the material details of Templar life had been considered. A knight was typically permitted several horses, most commonly a powerful war horse, trained to remain steady amid noise and chaos, alongside one or two lighter riding horses for ordinary travel, since Adestria's strength was far too valuable to waste on routine journeys between houses. Each knight was also assigned a squire, drawn from the order's non-noble servants, responsible for the unglamorous daily labour of tending horses, cleaning armour, and preparing equipment, work that receives little attention in most retellings of chivalric life, but without which no medieval army could have functioned for even a single day. A knight's arms were kept simple and functional rather than ornamental. A sword, a lance, a shield bearing the order's cross, mail armour covering the body, and over it all, the white or brown mantle marking him instantly as a brother of the temple, visible from a considerable distance across open ground. A fact that cut two ways, making a Templar column easy for allies to rally toward, and equally easy for a watching enemy to recognise and single out. There is something in this rhythm: prayer, then labour, then prayer again, over and over, day after day, for years, for an entire lifetime. That feels, even now, strangely restful to imagine. Not because their lives were easy, they were not, but because there was so little uncertainty in the shape of each day. A modern mind, accustomed to decisions arriving from every direction at once, might find something quietly enviable in a life built around so few, so clearly defined choices. Pray, work, rest, pray again. As the 12th century wore on, the Order's military role in the Holy Land grew steadily more central to the survival of the Crusader kingdoms themselves. The original mission, escorting pilgrims along the roads, expanded naturally into something larger, the defense of an entire fragile frontier. The Kingdom of Jerusalem and its sister Crusader states along the eastern Mediterranean coast were, in truth, always a thin, exposed strip of territory, surrounded on nearly every side by larger, more populous Muslim states and principalities that were, for long stretches of time, simply too divided among themselves to muster the strength for a unified counterattack. The Templars, alongside the similarly structured Knights Hospitaller, became something like the standing professional army the Crusader kingdoms otherwise lacked. Permanent, trained, disciplined forces in a region where most other troops were seasonal volunteers who came east for a single campaign and then sailed home again. The relationship between these two great military orders was itself a complicated, layered thing, closer to the relationship between two long-established neighbouring families than to any simple partnership. The Hospitallers had actually begun a little earlier than the Templars, originally founded to run a hospital in Jerusalem caring for sick and injured pilgrims, only later developing their own military wing alongside their original charitable mission. And they wore black mantles marked with a white cross, distinct enough from Templar white and red to be told apart at a glance across a crowded battlefield. The two orders fought alongside each other in nearly every major engagement across 2 centuries, shared the same frontier, faced the same enemies, and depended on each other in ways that made genuine cooperation essential to the survival of the Crusader states as a whole. And yet, being human institutions built from human ambitions, they also competed for land grants, for royal favour, for prestige, and occasionally, In moments of poor coordination during a campaign, their rivalry cost both sides more than either would have liked to admit. It is a very old, very ordinary kind of story, in the end. Two proud institutions, devoted to the same cause, who did not always find it easy to fully trust one another, even while relying on each other for their very survival. To hold that frontier, the Order built and garrisoned an extraordinary chain of fortresses, many of which still stand today in various states of ruin across modern Israel, Syria, Lebanon and Cyprus, their pale stone walls rising out of hillsides where olive trees now grow between the fallen blocks. There was Safed in the hills of Galilee, rebuilt by the Templars into one of the most formidable castles in the entire Crusader world, garrisoned in peacetime by a force numbering in the hundreds, and swelling to well over 1,000 defenders, counting local auxiliaries, in times of siege. There was Chastelblanc, the White Castle, its keep rising from a hilltop in what is now Syria. There was Tortosa, on the coast, and Chateau Pellerin, the Pilgrim's Castle, built directly on a narrow spit of land jutting into the Mediterranean, so well defended by sea and land alike that it would remain in Crusader hands even after almost every other stronghold on the mainland had fallen. These were not simple structures. Templar builders in the Levant developed increasingly sophisticated designs across the 12th and 13th centuries, layering wall within wall in what modern historians call concentric fortification, an outer curtain wall, then open ground that offered attackers no cover, then a second, higher inner wall behind it, so that even if a besieging army breached the first line, they found themselves trapped and exposed beneath the arrows of defenders on the second. Massive cisterns cut into the bedrock beneath many of these castles could store enough rainwater to sustain a garrison through months of siege, an essential precaution in a region where a besieging army's most reliable weapon was often simple, patient thirst. Standing today among the fallen stones of a castle like Safed or Tortosa, it is still possible to trace the outline of these old defensive instincts in the shape of the ruins themselves. Walls built not for beauty, though beauty sometimes came anyway, in the warm colour of the local limestone at sunset, but for the specific, practical purpose of letting a small number of determined defenders hold an enormous stretch of exposed frontier. Building and maintaining fortresses on this scale in a foreign land, far from Europe's timber forests and skilled masons, was itself a logistical undertaking of enormous complexity, which is, perhaps, one more quiet reason the Order's financial network back in Europe mattered so much. Every stone castle in the Holy Land was, in a very real sense, paid for by a farm in the French countryside, a vineyard in Aragon, a wool trading operation in England. The war in the East and the quiet agricultural life of the West were bound together by an invisible thread of coin and letters of credit passing constantly back and forth across the Mediterranean. The Order's growing military reputation was tested on a larger stage in 1147, when a new call to crusade went out across Europe, prompted by the fall of a Crusader outpost called Edessa to a resurgent Muslim power in the north. Bernard of Clairvaux, the same monk who had championed the Templars' founding, preached this new campaign, later remembered as the Second Crusade, across France and Germany with the same persuasive force he had once used on their behalf. The Templars, by then a seasoned and well-organised fighting force, played an important logistical role in the difficult overland march east, helping to hold together an enormous, unwieldy army of European volunteers as it crossed hostile, unfamiliar territory in Anatolia. A campaign that ultimately ended in disappointment for the wider crusading effort, but that further cemented the Templars' standing as the most professionally organised force in any Crusader army, whatever the outcome of any single campaign. Life inside the frontier castles of the Levant, meanwhile, was never quite as simple as a story of constant battle might suggest. For long stretches of time, particularly during the many negotiated truces that punctuated the century of conflict, a Templar garrison and its Muslim neighbours lived in a kind of wary, practical coexistence, trading in local markets, sharing knowledge of the land, even, in some documented cases, sharing physicians, since medical knowledge in the Islamic world of this period was, in several respects, considerably more advanced than in contemporary Western Europe. Some Templar brothers picked up enough spoken Arabic to negotiate directly with local merchants and officials, a practical skill that had nothing to do with any grand theological compromise and everything to do with the ordinary business of running a household, a market, and a frontier, however uneasy that frontier might remain. If you are still with me at this point, drifting somewhere between listening and dreaming, that's exactly where you're meant to be. Let your shoulders soften into whatever is beneath them. There is still more of this long, slow story ahead, and none of it requires you to stay awake for it. For nearly 7 decades after the Order's founding, the balance of power in the Holy Land shifted back and forth in slow, uneven waves. Territory won here, lost there, treaties made and broken, a fragile peace occasionally settling over the frontier before some new ambition on one side or the other disturbed it again. Through all of it, the Templars remained a constant, visible presence. Their white mantles and red crosses a familiar sight on the roads, in the garrisons, the negotiating tables where Crusader lords occasionally, and sometimes controversially, made pragmatic truces with their Muslim neighbours. But in the 1170s and 1180s, a single figure emerged on the other side of that frontier who would change the shape of the entire conflict, and with it, the fortunes of the Templar Order itself. His name, as most people who have heard even a little of Crusader history will recognise, was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West simply as Saladin. Originally a Kurdish general serving under the rulers of Syria and Egypt, Saladin gradually unified those two powerful, previously rival territories under his own leadership through a combination of military skill and patient political maneuvering, creating, for the first time in generations, a single Muslim power strong enough to seriously threaten the fragmented Crusader states. Saladin was, by most accounts from both sides of the conflict, a genuinely formidable and in many ways a notably principled adversary, respected even by many of his Christian enemies for a code of conduct that at its better moments showed real restraint and mercy, particularly compared to some of the brutality that had marked the initial Crusader conquest of Jerusalem in 1099. That reputation, however, did not extend especially far toward the Templars and Hospitallers specifically. The military orders were, in Saladin's eyes, a permanent, professional, deeply committed enemy in a way that ordinary Crusader knights who might return home after a single campaign were not. It is recorded that Saladin, on more than one occasion, showed particular severity toward captured Templars and Hospitallers precisely because he understood they would never truly stop fighting him, whatever terms were offered. That tension reached its terrible climax in July of 1187, on a dry, sun-scorched hillside in Galilee known as the Horns of Hattin, named for 2 rocky peaks that rose from the landscape like the horns of some great sleeping animal. The full Crusader army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, drawn from across the kingdom in a desperate attempt to relieve a besieged city, had marched out across open, waterless terrain in the height of summer, misjudging both the distance and Saladin's ability to control the few available water sources along the route. What followed was less a battle in the traditional sense than a slow, agonizing collapse, an army dying of thirst and exhaustion even before the fighting reached its worst point, harassed constantly by mounted archers, until the Crusader forces, disoriented and desperate, were finally surrounded and largely destroyed. I will not linger on the details of that day longer than is needed, because they are genuinely painful ones, and this is not the hour for painful things. What matters for our story is this. A great many Templar and Hospitaller knights were among those captured in the aftermath, and Saladin, breaking from his usual practice of ransoming noble prisoners, ordered the captured members of the 2 military orders executed, sparing only the Templar Grand Master, whose fate would nonetheless catch up with him in the difficult years that followed. It was, without exaggeration, one of the single most devastating blows the order would ever suffer. A near-total loss of an entire generation of its most experienced knights in a single terrible afternoon. Jerusalem itself fell to Saladin later that same year, its Christian population departing the city under negotiated terms far gentler, it should be said, than the terms under which the Crusaders themselves had taken the city 90 years earlier. And with Jerusalem's fall, something in the entire Crusader project changed permanently. Even though the story of the Crusader states in the Levant would continue, in diminishing form, for another full century after that. News of Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem reached Europe like a slow-spreading shock, prompting a new wave of crusading fervour. What history would remember as the Third Crusade, drawing famous figures such as England's King Richard I, later remembered as Richard the Lionheart, and the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, across the sea to try to reclaim what had been lost. The Templars, rebuilding their shattered ranks, fought alongside these new arrivals through years of grinding, inconclusive campaigning along the coast, eventually helping to secure a fragile peace that left Jerusalem itself in Muslim hands, but preserved a narrow strip of Crusader territory along the Mediterranean coastline, anchored by cities like Acre, Tyre and Tripoli. The decades that followed brought further campaigns, each one a little smaller in ambition than the one before, as Europe's crusading enthusiasm slowly cooled. In the early 13th century, a campaign remembered as the Fifth Crusade attempted, unsuccessfully, to strike at the heart of Muslim power by attacking Egypt directly, landing an army at the port city of Damietta on the Nile Delta, with Templar forces once again among the most disciplined units in the field, though the campaign ultimately ended in a costly withdrawal. Decades later, in the 1250s, the pious French king Louis IX led his own crusade to Egypt, was captured after a disastrous defeat, and was ultimately ransomed and released. A negotiation in which Templar resources and Templar diplomacy, once again, played a quiet but essential role behind the scenes. Louis would try again years later, dying of illness outside the walls of Tunis in 1270, before his final campaign could accomplish very much at all. Each of these efforts drew smaller armies than the ones before, funded by kings with less enthusiasm and populations with less appetite for a war that seemed to promise more suffering than glory. Through all of it, the Templars remained, patient and professional, one of the last truly permanent fixtures of a crusading project that was, piece by piece, losing its hold on the European imagination. For the following century, this became the Templars' new reality, not the defense of Jerusalem itself, which remained a Muslim city under the terms of successive treaties for most of this period, but the defense of an ever-shrinking coastal strip held together by castles, garrisons, and increasingly fragile diplomacy. While the political will for new crusades back in Europe slowly, unmistakably began to fade, kings had other wars to fight closer to home. New generations grew up who had never known a Europe where crusading was the great unifying cause it had once been. And piece by piece, through the 13th century, the remaining Crusader territories in the Levant contracted, city by city, until only a handful remained. The end, when it finally came at Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold on the Levantine coast, a wealthy, crowded port city that had become, in its final decades, something like the last capital of an idea that had once spanned the length of an entire coastline. In the spring of 1291, a vast Mamluk army, drawn from the powerful Sultanate that had by then risen to control Egypt and much of Syria, laid siege to the city with overwhelming numbers and a formidable array of siege engines. The defenders, a mixed garrison that included the Templars, the Hospitallers, and various other Christian forces, hopelessly outnumbered, held out for weeks against odds that left little real hope of relief arriving from Europe in time. The Templar Grand Master at the time, a knight named Guillaume de Beaujeu, was among those who died defending the walls in the final days of the siege, struck down, according to the accounts that survive, while leading a desperate defence near one of the city's gates. When Acre finally fell on the 18th of May, 1291, the last significant Crusader foothold on the mainland of the Holy Land went with it. A small remaining garrison held a fortified position on a nearby islet for a short while longer before finally evacuating as well, closing, in the quietest and least ceremonial way imaginable, a chapter of European history that had opened with such enormous ambition nearly 2 centuries earlier. The Knights Templar, along with the surviving Crusader nobility and the Hospitallers, withdrew to the island of Cyprus, which had been in Crusader hands since Richard the Lionheart's campaigns a century before. And there, for the first time in the Order's entire existence, the Templars found themselves facing a genuinely uncomfortable question, one that had never truly needed answering before. What was the purpose of an order built entirely around the defence of the Holy Land, now that there was no Holy Land left for them to defend? It is worth sitting quietly with that question for a moment, because it is, in its own way, one of the more human and tender parts of this entire story. Imagine an institution. Imagine even an individual person who has spent an entire lifetime organized around a single clear purpose, only to watch that purpose dissolve entirely, not through any failure of their own devotion, but simply because the world around them had changed in ways beyond their control. The Templars had not grown lazy or unfaithful to their mission. They had held Acre until the walls themselves gave way, and still the mission was gone. Here in the middle of the story, in this quiet island interlude between one world and the next, feels like as gentle a place as any to say something I've been meaning to say. If this slow retelling has been good company tonight, resting a like on your way past costs nothing at all, and subscribing means this particular kind of history will simply be waiting for you the next time sleep feels far away. There's no need to do anything else. Just settle back in and let's keep going. On Cyprus, in the years following the loss of Acre, the surviving leadership of the Order turned its attention toward the future, drafting proposals for how a new crusade might one day be organized and how the Holy Land might, in some still-imagined future, be won back. Jacques de Molay himself, not long after his election as Grand Master, travelled between European courts, making exactly this case to kings and to the Pope, arguing that the Order's purpose was not finished, only paused. There was even serious discussion, encouraged from within the Church itself, of merging the Templars with their old comrades and rivals, the Knights Hospitaller, into a single unified military order, a proposal Molay resisted, believing the two orders' distinct identities, built up over nearly 2 centuries each, were worth preserving. It is a small, almost administrative detail in the grand sweep of the story, but it says something quietly touching about the Order's state of mind in these final years. Still planning, still hoping, still imagining a future in which the mission might resume, even as the ground beneath them, unseen and unimagined, was already beginning to shift in an entirely different direction. What remained, of course, was everything else the Order had quietly built across those same 2 centuries. The vast European network of estates and preceptories, the extraordinary financial system, the enormous inherited wealth, the close, complicated, often tense relationships with kings across the continent, who had, over the decades, become deeply indebted to Templar coffers. The Order that returned from the Holy Land, diminished in its original purpose, but still immensely rich, and still answerable to no earthly ruler but the distant Pope, settled itself ever more firmly into its European strongholds. And nowhere more visibly than at the great fortified Paris Temple, with its high stone keep rising over the rooftops of the French capital like a watchtower over a city that had never quite decided whether to admire the Templars or resent them. By this point in their history, the Templars occupied a strange, singular position in European society, enormously respected by some, quietly resented by others, and genuinely misunderstood, in various small ways, by nearly everyone who was not a member. To the pious, they remained honoured defenders of the faith, worthy of donations, prayers and admiration. To indebted kings and cash-strapped nobles across the continent, they had gradually become something closer to an uncomfortable creditor, the way any lender eventually becomes to a borrower who cannot quite settle the account. To rival institutions within the Church itself, their independence from local bishops and their direct line of loyalty to the distant Pope alone occasionally bred a quiet institutional jealousy. And to ordinary townspeople who passed the high windowless walls of a Templar preceptory without ever once being invited inside, the Order's private wealth, private courts, and private ceremonies could look, depending on the mood of the moment, either impressively disciplined or faintly suspicious. None of this on its own was unusual. Most powerful medieval institutions collected some version of the same mixed reputation. But it meant that when a king motivated by debt and ambition eventually decided to move against the Order, he would not be moving against an institution with no critics at all, but into a climate of public opinion that already contained at least a few pre-existing, if largely unremarkable, seeds of doubt. And it was in Paris, in the opening years of the 14th century, that the Order's fortunes would take their final quiet turn, not on any battlefield, but in the mind of a king who found himself, as so many kings before him had, deeply and uncomfortably in debt to the very knights who were meant to be beyond the reach of ordinary politics. His name was Philip IV of France, a tall, striking, coldly composed monarch whom his contemporaries sometimes called Philip the Fair, referring not to any particular gentleness of character, but simply to his appearance. Philip had spent years fighting costly wars, and years too, quietly reorganizing and centralizing the power of the French crown in ways that made older, more independent institutions within his kingdom increasingly uneasy. The Templars, with their vast wealth, their fortress in the heart of his own capital, their independence from royal authority, and, perhaps most uncomfortably of all, the substantial sums Philip himself owed them, represented exactly the kind of institution a king determined to centralize power might in time come to see less as an ally than as an obstacle. The pressures weighing on Philip in these years were real and considerable. Whatever judgment history has since passed on how he chose to answer them, a long, expensive war against the county of Flanders had drained the royal treasury far faster than it could be refilled through ordinary taxation. To cover the shortfall, Philip had repeatedly debased the kingdom's coinage, reducing the actual silver content of French coins while insisting on their old face value, a practice that brought short-term relief to the crown and considerable resentment among his own subjects, who watched their money quietly lose its worth in their hands. He had also, in 1306, ordered the expulsion of the kingdom's Jewish community, seizing considerable assets in the process, a decision, like so much in this period, driven at least in part by the crown's persistent hunger for funds. Against this backdrop, a wealthy, well-defended institution sitting on enormous reserves of coin, answerable to a distant pope rather than to Philip himself, and holding a substantial portion of the king's own personal debt, understandably began to look to a king already inclined towards centralizing every form of power within his reach, like unfinished business. By the autumn of 1307, though almost no one outside a small circle of the king's closest advisers yet knew it, that quiet unease had already curdled into something far more deliberate. Documents were being drawn up in secret. Instructions were being sent, sealed and unopened, to royal officials in towns and cities across the Kingdom of France, with orders that they were to be opened only on a single specific date, still weeks away, and acted upon immediately and simultaneously the moment they were. Jacques de Molay, the order's Grand Master at the time, an experienced, aging knight who had spent much of his career in the Holy Land and Cyprus before being elected to lead the order in 1292, in the difficult years right after the fall of Acre, appears, from what evidence survives, to have had little idea of what was quietly gathering around him. In the final weeks of that autumn, records place him in Paris, attending the funeral of a member of the French royal family, walking among mourners as an honoured guest, one of the kingdom's most respected figures, still trusted enough to be given the honour of helping to carry the funeral pall. It is a striking image to hold on to, knowing what was still hidden just beneath the surface of those quiet formal days. An old soldier, walking in solemn procession through the streets of Paris, entirely unaware that the ground beneath the order he led had already, secretly, begun to shift. The sealed instructions Philip's officials carried were dated to be opened on a single Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, a coincidence of calendar and history that would, centuries later, help fasten a lingering superstition about that particular combination of day and date into popular imagination, even though the far older folklore around Friday and around the number 13 individually had existed long before that October morning, and the direct link between this specific event and the modern superstition is something historians regard more as a much later, popular embellishment than as a fact firmly rooted in the medieval record itself. What is not embellishment, what is recorded plainly and repeatedly across surviving documents from that autumn, is this: as the sun rose over towns and cities across the Kingdom of France on that particular Friday morning, in Paris and dozens of other places at once, the sealed orders were opened, and royal officers moved, in careful pre-arranged coordination, toward the gates of Templar houses that had, until that very moment, stood as some of the most secure and untouchable institutions in the whole of Christendom. The candle in the Paris temple has not yet gone out. The gates have not yet opened to men who mean harm. Somewhere in that great stone fortress, brothers who have spent their whole lives believing themselves beyond the reach of ordinary kings are still asleep in their narrow beds, unaware, still trusting in walls that have kept them safe for nearly 2 centuries, still breathing slowly in the last dark hour before a Friday morning that will not resemble any morning that came before it. The light that morning came up thin and grey over the rooftops of Paris, the kind of pale autumn light that makes every stone in a city look a little older than it is. And into that ordinary grey light, at an hour when most of the city was still only beginning to stir, riders moved quietly through the streets toward the high walls of the Paris Temple, carrying with them a royal order that had been sealed, guarded and waited upon for weeks. The man who had organised this moment down to its smallest detail was Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's chief legal advisor, a sharp, methodical royal official who had built his career on exactly this kind of careful, comprehensive planning. Word had gone out weeks earlier, in absolute secrecy, to bailiffs and seneschals in towns across the Kingdom of France, instructing them to gather men, prepare warrants, and wait for a single date. That date had now arrived. And so, in Paris and in dozens of towns beyond it, at very nearly the same hour on the same Friday morning, the doors of Templar houses were reached, and the brothers inside, men who had woken, as they had woken every morning of their adult lives, to the sound of the bell calling them to prayer, found royal officers waiting instead. The sheer logistical coordination behind this single morning is on its own worth pausing over, a level of administrative planning genuinely unusual for the period, achieved without telegraph, telephone or any means of communication faster than a mounted rider. Instructions had to reach local officials in scores of towns scattered across a kingdom that stretched from the English Channel to the Mediterranean coast. Each set of orders sealed and kept unopened until the appointed date. Each local official trusted not to act early and give the wider operation away. That it worked as smoothly as it did says a great deal about the efficiency Philip's government had built in other areas of royal administration, resources that might, in a kinder telling of this same king's reign, have been remembered for entirely different achievements. There was, by most surviving accounts, remarkably little resistance, whether this was because the Templars, as sworn monastics, felt bound not to raise arms against agents of a Christian king, or simply because the arrests were so quick, so total, and so thoroughly unexpected that resistance was never genuinely possible, historians still debate. What is certain is that on that single morning, somewhere in the range of 600 Templars across the Kingdom of France, including Jacques de Molay himself, taken at the Paris Temple along with dozens of his senior officers, passed, within the space of a few quiet hours, from being among the most secure and untouchable men in Christendom to being prisoners of the French crown. Set against the order's full membership across the whole of Europe, likely numbering in the low thousands by this later, diminished stage in its history, considerably reduced from the far larger totals of a century earlier, 600 was a meaningful fraction, but by no means the whole. It was, however, precisely the fraction that mattered most for Philip's purposes. Concentrated in the kingdom he actually ruled, including nearly the entire senior leadership of the order, who happened, by simple historical coincidence, to have gathered in Paris in the months before the arrests for reasons entirely unconnected to any suspicion of what was coming. Removing this one concentrated group, Philip's advisors seemed to have calculated correctly, would be enough to bring down the order's entire European structure, even though the great majority of individual Templars, scattered across preceptories from Portugal to Poland, were never personally arrested, interrogated, or even directly threatened at all. It is worth pausing here, gently, on the sheer strangeness of that reversal, because it is really the heart of why this story has held people's attention for so many centuries. These were not soldiers caught unprepared on some open battlefield. They were men who, the evening before, had gone to sleep inside walls that had protected the order's wealth and independence for nearly 200 years, believing themselves, reasonably, on the evidence of everything that had come before, to be beyond the reach of any single king's ambition, and within the space of one morning, that entire sense of permanence simply gave way. Picture for a moment an ordinary Templar brother in one of the smaller provincial preceptories that morning, Not a famous name, not one of the senior officers history remembers, simply one of the many hundreds of quiet, unremarkable men who had spent their adult lives tending Templar land, keeping Templar accounts, praying at the appointed hours in a chapel that had, until this particular Friday, always felt like the safest place in the world. He would have risen in the dark, as he always did, for the first prayers of the day. He may have heard the horses arrive before he understood what their arrival meant. A sound that, on any other morning, would simply have meant visitors or messengers, or nothing at all worth remarking on. And then, quite suddenly, the ordinary shape of his entire life would have folded inward, in the space of a single conversation at the gate, into something unrecognizable. This is perhaps the detail that makes the story land most heavily, even across 7 centuries of distance. Not the scale of it, though the scale was genuinely enormous, but the sheer, disorienting speed with which an entire way of life, built up patiently over generations, could be dismantled within the span of a single sunrise. The charges brought against the arrested Templars in the days that followed were serious, strange, and, by the standards of any careful modern investigation, deeply troubling in how they were obtained. The order was accused of a long list of offences against the faith it had sworn its entire existence to defend, that new members were made, in secret initiation ceremonies, to deny Christ and spit upon the cross, that the order secretly worshipped an idol, sometimes described in the resulting documents as a bearded head, later given the name Baphomet by a scholar centuries afterward, though the confessions themselves used no single consistent name or description, that brothers engaged in improper conduct with one another, and that the order's leadership had in effect corrupted its own sacred purpose from the inside for generations. These were the kinds of accusations in the religious culture of medieval Europe, calculated to produce the maximum possible horror and the maximum possible justification for harsh action. Heresy was, in this period, considered not simply a private failing, but a danger to the entire spiritual health of a kingdom. To understand why such charges could gain any traction at all, it helps to remember the wider religious climate of the era into which they were introduced. The decades before the Templar arrests had seen the Church, particularly in southern France, wage a long and often brutal campaign against a genuinely unrelated religious movement known as the Cathars, whose beliefs departed from mainstream Catholic teaching in ways that authorities of the time considered a serious and organised threat. Out of that earlier conflict had grown a formal apparatus of inquiry, what history remembers as the Inquisition, staffed by trained investigators experienced in extracting confessions and building cases against suspected heretics. By 1307, the tools, the language, and the public appetite for exactly this kind of accusation were already firmly in place, developed and refined against an entirely different target a generation earlier. Philip's advisors, in building their case against the Templars, did not need to invent a new machinery of suspicion. They simply pointed an already existing one in a new and, for the crown, considerably more profitable direction. And confessions to these very charges did in fact follow, a great many of them, including, eventually, one from Jacques de Molay himself. Molay's own confession came remarkably quickly, within days of his arrest, given before the Grand Inquisitor of France himself. In it, according to the surviving record, he acknowledged that new members of the order had, as part of their secret initiation, been made to deny Christ in some manner, though he denied several of the more extreme accusations circulating at the same time, including the alleged veneration of any idol. It is a detail worth sitting with gently, because it captures something true about the whole affair. Even under pressure, even isolated and frightened, Molay's earliest statements were partial, hedged, and inconsistent with the full weight of charges the Crown wished to prove, the kind of uneven, incomplete admission, far more consistent with a frightened man trying to survive an impossible situation than with a genuinely guilty conspirator finally caught. It would be easy, hearing that, to take the confessions at face value. Historians, looking back across 7 centuries with the benefit of considerably more documentation than was available at the time, have overwhelmingly come to a gentler and more troubling conclusion instead. The methods used by royal and inquisitorial officials to obtain these confessions were, by every reliable account that survives, coercive in the extreme. The standard, harsh interrogation practices of medieval inquisitorial process applied here with particular intensity because the crown had a considerable financial and political interest in the Templars being found guilty. Under such pressure, in an era when confession, however extracted, was often treated as sufficient proof on its own, it is not difficult to understand why so many frightened, isolated men, cut off from their brothers and given very little reason to hope for a fair hearing, eventually told their questioners whatever those questioners seemed to want to hear. We will not linger on the details of how those confessions were obtained. It is enough, and truer to the spirit of careful history, to say plainly that most modern historians regard the resulting confessions as unreliable evidence of any actual wrongdoing, and view the entire process as driven far more by royal debt and royal ambition than by any genuine well-founded suspicion of heresy. Not every brother responded to this pressure in the same way, and the variation itself tells its own quiet story. Some confessed quickly and never wavered afterward, perhaps genuinely persuaded, in their isolation and fear, that resistance served no purpose. Others confessed and later retracted, only to confess again when threatened with the harsher fate reserved for relapsed heretics, caught in an exhausting cycle between the safety of compliance and the pull of conscience. And a smaller number refused to confess at all, from the very first interrogation to the last, whatever pressure was brought against them. Men whose names survive today mostly as brief notations in inquisitorial records, unfamous, unrewarded for their consistency, remembered by history, if at all only in the driest and most administrative of surviving documents. There is no single tidy way to describe how nearly 2,000 individual men responded to the same impossible situation, and history, at its most honest, resists flattening them all into either uniform victims or uniform confessors. They were, in the end, simply as varied and as human as any other large group of frightened people, facing the same danger from as many different private angles as there were men to face it. Philip's government, meanwhile, worked hard to shape how ordinary people across the kingdom understood what was happening. Royal officials arranged for public sermons to be preached on the steps of Notre Dame and in market squares across France, presenting the confessions as settled fact and framing the king's actions as those of a devoted defender of the faith, rather than a debtor moving against his own creditor. It was, in its way, one of the more effective public information campaigns of the entire medieval period, not because the underlying case was strong, but because it was told confidently, repeatedly, and to an audience with no easy means of checking it against any other version of events. Much of Europe, in the years immediately following the arrests, simply absorbed the official account as the only account available, which is very often how history gets its first, most durable shape long before quieter, more careful investigation has any chance to catch up. It is worth pausing to notice, gently, just how much of this story we are able to tell at all, 700 years later, and why. Unlike a great many medieval institutions, whose day-to-day inner life has vanished almost entirely from the historical record, the Templar trials generated an enormous quantity of paperwork, interrogation transcripts, notarized statements, formal depositions taken down word for word by trained clerks in city after city across Europe, much of it still preserved today in French and Vatican archives. It is, in a strange and slightly uncomfortable way, one of the ironies of the whole affair. The very process that destroyed the order also produced one of the most detailed written records of any medieval religious institution's internal life that survives from this entire period, allowing historians centuries later to reconstruct this story in far greater and more intimate detail than they can manage for almost any comparable order that simply continued on, quietly and undramatically, without ever attracting a king's suspicion. Separately from all of that unhappy trial paperwork, something gentler survives as well. Copies of the order's original rule itself, the very same set of regulations drawn up at Troyes back in 1129, and expanded steadily across the 2 centuries that followed, preserved in several medieval manuscripts that scholars still study today. Reading through those old clauses now, centuries after the last brother who lived by them has been gone, offers a rather different window into the order than the trial records do. not confessions extracted under pressure, but the order's own quiet, careful description of how it wished to live, written by men with no idea their words would ever need defending before hostile inquisitors. It is, in its own way, one of the more touching survivals from this whole long story. The accuser's version and the accused's own daily rulebook, sitting side by side in archives today, letting anyone patient enough to read both decide for themselves which version sounds more like the truth. Word of the arrests reached Pope Clement V within days, and his initial reaction, based on the surviving correspondence, was one of genuine anger, not at the Templars, but at Philip. The Templars were, after all, an order answerable directly to the papacy, not to any king, and Philip's unilateral action, seizing and interrogating brothers of the temple without so much as consulting Rome first, represented a direct challenge to papal authority itself. For a brief period in the winter of 1307 and 1308, it seemed genuinely possible that Clement might resist Philip's campaign entirely and defend the order against what he plainly recognized, at least at first, as an overreach by the French crown. But Clement was, in the end, a considerably weaker figure than the king he was contending with. He had been elected largely through French influence, resided not in Rome but in the southern French city of Avignon, close enough to Philip's reach that the political reality of his position was difficult to ignore for long. Under sustained pressure, including, according to some accounts, thinly veiled threats regarding Clement's own predecessor, Pope Boniface VIII, who had died shortly after a violent confrontation with Philip's agents some years earlier, Clement's resistance gradually softened. He issued a formal bull authorizing a broader investigation into the order across all of Christendom, not only France, effectively allowing the process Philip had begun to spread outward into a matter of official church concern rather than remaining a purely French royal action. This particular arrangement, a pope residing in France, within comfortable reach of a French king's influence rather than safely established in Rome, was itself a fairly recent, and in hindsight, quietly consequential development. The papacy's move to Avignon had come about only a few years earlier, in 1309, not long after the Templar arrest began, part of a longer period of tension between the French crown and the papal office that had already, as it happened, cost Clement's predecessor his life in the aftermath of Philip's confrontation with him. Later generations of historians would come to refer to this entire era of the papacy's residence in France, which stretched on for decades after Clement's own death, as a kind of exile, and it is difficult, looking back, not to see the Templar affair as one of the earliest and clearest illustrations of exactly what that geographic closeness cost the Church's independence. A pope who might, in an earlier or later century, have found it easier to resist a king's demands, finding himself instead only a short ride from that same king's court, with all the quiet, constant pressure that proximity implied. What followed was a long, painful, uneven process that stretched across nearly 5 more years, playing out differently in different kingdoms. In some parts of Europe, in Portugal, in Aragon, in parts of Germany and Italy, local rulers and churchmen showed considerably more skepticism toward the charges than Philip had, and Templars in those regions were often investigated far more gently, in some cases formally cleared of wrongdoing entirely by local church councils, who found the evidence presented against them thin and the confessions, obtained as they had been in France, unpersuasive. In England, King Edward II initially resisted arresting the Templars at all, doing so only reluctantly once continued papal pressure made refusal politically impossible, and even then, English interrogators found remarkably little evidence to support the more sensational charges being made across the Channel. In the Kingdom of Aragon, in northeastern Spain, the story took an even more striking turn. King James II, unlike Philip, showed little appetite for a swift, coordinated crackdown, and when royal officials did eventually move against the order, a number of Aragonese Templars chose not to submit quietly at all. Small garrisons of knights barricaded themselves inside several of their own fortified castles, most notably at Miravet, a formidable Templar stronghold perched above the Ebro River, and held out for months against a besieging royal force, an extraordinary act of open, physical resistance found almost nowhere else in the entire continent-wide suppression of the order. The siege at Miravet dragged on for the better part of a year before the defenders, recognizing their situation as ultimately hopeless, agreed to a negotiated surrender rather than fighting to the last man, and the Aragonese Templars who surrendered there were treated, in the years that followed, with considerably more leniency than their French brothers had received. In parts of Germany and Italy too, local church councils examining individual Templars often found the charges unconvincing, several bishops openly stating that they saw no credible evidence of heresy in the brothers brought before them, whatever conclusions had already been reached in Paris. In the Kingdom of Naples in southern Italy, King Robert showed a similar reluctance to Aragon's own king, and local Templars there were, on the whole, treated with a mildness that stood in sharp, almost uncomfortable contrast to what their brothers were enduring in France during these very same years. A reminder, if one were needed, that the whole affair was never quite the unified, continent-wide judgment on the order's guilt that Philip's own propaganda liked to suggest, but rather a patchwork of very different responses, shaped as much by each ruler's own political relationship with Philip and with the papacy as by any independent assessment of the actual evidence. If your mind has started to drift a little, that's more than all right. None of these place names or dates need to stay with you. Let them pass the way names in a story you're half remembering always do, softly, without effort, without any need to hold on to a single one of them. The only thing that matters is the shape of it all, settling slowly over you like a blanket someone else has already warmed. It is in this variation, this patchwork of different outcomes in different kingdoms, that the real, more grounded story of what actually happened to the Knights Templar begins to take shape. A story considerably less mysterious, and in its own way considerably more human than the idea of an order simply vanishing into thin air. In Portugal, King Denis found an elegant solution that satisfied both Rome's demand for the Templars' formal dissolution and his own reluctance to lose the order's considerable local resources and manpower. The Portuguese Templars were reorganized, with the Pope's eventual approval, into a new order entirely called the Order of Christ, which inherited much of the old Templar property, retained many of the same brothers, and would go on, more than a century later, to help fund and organise the very earliest Portuguese voyages of exploration down the coast of Africa under Prince Henry, still remembered by historians as Henry the Navigator, meaning that a thread of Templar wealth and organisation, however transformed, quietly ran forward into the age of oceanic exploration that would eventually reshape the entire world. In many other kingdoms, surviving Templars, once the order was formally dissolved, were simply absorbed into other institutions or granted modest pensions to live out their remaining years in quiet retirement, often within monasteries that had once been rival or allied institutions. The Knights Hospitaller, the order's old comrades and occasional rivals from the frontier castles of the Levant, received a substantial share of the dissolved Templar properties across much of Europe, in effect inheriting a portion of the very network the Templars had spent 2 centuries building. Many ordinary Templar sergeants, chaplains and elderly knights, who were never accused of any personal wrongdoing, simply faded, in the most literal and least dramatic sense possible, into the general population of medieval Europe. Men who had spent their whole adult lives as brothers of a great order, quietly becoming, in their final years, simply old men, largely indistinguishable from any other retired soldier or servant of the Church. Even the order's last true foothold, Cyprus itself, the quiet island where the Templars had settled after the loss of Acre, and where Jacques de Molay had once argued so patiently for the future of a new crusade, was not spared the wider suppression, despite lying well outside the reach of Philip's own kingdom. Local Templars there were arrested and investigated in turn, under pressure from the same papal bull that had extended the inquiry across all of Christendom, and the island's substantial Templar holdings passed, like so much else, into Hospitaller hands. It is a quietly fitting detail in its own way that the very last piece of ground the order had held in any meaningful continuity with its original Holy Land mission should also be the place where its final, ordinary dissolution played out, not with drama, but with the same slow administrative transfer of land and title that was unfolding, in these same years, in kingdom after kingdom across the continent. This is, in its own quiet way, the gentlest possible answer to the question the title of tonight's story poses. The question of how such an order could seem to vanish overnight. Most of its members did not vanish at all. They were reassigned, absorbed, pensioned, or simply left to grow old, their individual stories folding quietly back into the enormous, largely undocumented ocean of ordinary medieval life. What vanished, abruptly and unmistakably, was not the men themselves so much as the order's identity. Its independence, its distinctive white mantle, its unique place as an institution answerable to no earthly king. That identity was extinguished with real suddenness, in a way that a slower, gentler decline never could have matched. And it is that suddenness, more than any genuine disappearance of the individual people involved, that has echoed down through 7 centuries of retelling. It is worth returning just for a moment to the very place where all of this began. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem, that same converted mosque where 9 tired men once slept in poverty, sharing horses, watching a road they had appointed themselves to protect. By the time Molay stood before his judges in Paris, that hill had already passed out of Christian hands entirely, restored to Muslim governance since Saladin's reconquest more than a century earlier, and it would remain so for centuries more, its own long, layered history continuing on in an entirely different direction, largely indifferent to the fate of the distant French order that had once called it home. The order's beginning and its end, in other words, played out on opposite edges of an enormous continent, separated by 200 years and 2,000 miles, connected only by the quiet, unbroken thread of an idea that had travelled the whole distance between them. There is something fitting in that geography, if you let yourself sit with it tonight. A story that begins on a sun-baked hill in the Levant, and ends on a cold, wet island in a French river, the entire arc of it stretching across the whole known world of its age, before finally, gently, coming to rest. There is one further group worth remembering gently here, easy to overlook amid the fate of the knights themselves. The far larger number of ordinary people whose lives were tied to Templar land without ever having taken a single vow. The farmers who worked Templar fields, the millers who ground grain on Templar streams, the shepherds who tended Templar flocks, the craftsmen who repaired Templar walls. For these men and women, the dissolution of the order meant not imprisonment or interrogation, but simply a change of landlord, as their fields and mills and flocks passed quietly into the hands of the hospitallers or the local crown. Their daily lives likely continued much as before. The harvest gathered in the same season, the same bell ringing from the same chapel tower, only now under a different banner and a different set of distant masters. It is a small, easily forgotten detail, but a genuinely comforting one, in its way, a reminder that even an ending as sudden and dramatic as this one left most of the ordinary human lives connected to it relatively undisturbed, the deep, patient rhythms of farm and village continuing on regardless of which order or king happened to hold the deed. The formal end came at a church council convened in the French city of Vienne, beginning in the autumn of 1311 and continuing into the spring of the following year. There, under continued pressure from Philip, and despite the fact that the council's own assembled bishops were reportedly divided, with a great many of them unconvinced that sufficient evidence existed to condemn the order as a whole, Pope Clement chose not to formally convict the Templars of heresy, but rather to suppress the order administratively, through a bull known by its opening Latin words, Vox in Excelso, issued in March of 1312. It was, in its own careful, bureaucratic way, an oddly gentle ending to such a dramatic beginning, not a dramatic condemnation, but a quiet administrative dissolution, the Pope choosing the safer, more cautious path of simply ending the order's legal existence, rather than either fully vindicating or fully condemning the brothers who had served in it. There is a quiet postscript to this particular part of the story, one that only came to light in the year 2001, nearly 7 full centuries after Clement made his decision. A researcher working through the Vatican's own archives came across a document that had, for reasons still not entirely clear, been filed for centuries under the wrong reference number, effectively hidden in plain sight rather than deliberately concealed. Known today as the Chinon parchment after the French castle where it was recorded, it describes a private meeting held in the summer of 1308 between Clement's own cardinals and the order's most senior leaders. including Jacques de Molay, conducted well away from Philip's direct influence. In that meeting, according to the parchment, the assembled Templars confessed to certain irregularities in their initiation practices, but were formally absolved of heresy by the Church's own representatives, their sins forgiven, and their standing within the faith privately restored. Clement, it seems, genuinely believed, at least for a time, that the most serious charges against the order could not be sustained, and yet, for reasons of pure political survival, chose never to make that private absolution public, allowing Philip's version of events to continue standing unchallenged before the wider world. It is a small, dry, archival detail, easy to pass over quickly, but it carries a real quiet weight if you let it settle. The Pope who ultimately dissolved the Knights Templar may have known, in his own private judgment, that they were innocent of the very crime used to destroy them, all along. For most of the roughly 2,000 Templars who had been swept up across Europe in the years since that October morning, this was, in the end, where their individual stories quietened into the wider fabric of medieval life, largely unrecorded, their names surviving today only in the scattered court and monastery records that historians still occasionally uncover. But for a small handful of the order's most senior leaders, held in Paris since the earliest days of the arrests, the story was not yet finished, and its final chapter would prove to be the part of this long history that has lingered longest in popular memory. Before we walk that final stretch of road together, let me pause for just a moment, gently, the way this story has paused once or twice already tonight. If these 2 long, quiet hours in the company of the Templars have been good company for you, a like on your way past helps this kind of slow, careful storytelling find its way to other people lying awake somewhere tonight. And subscribing means the Driftorian will simply be here, waiting quietly, the next time your own mind needs somewhere unhurried to rest. Whatever you decide, thank you for staying this long. Now softly, let's finish where this particular road leads. Alongside Jacques de Molay, 3 other senior officers of the order had spent these same long years as prisoners in Paris. Hugues de Parot, the order's visitor of France and one of its most senior administrators, Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, and Geoffroy de Gonville, preceptor of Aquitaine. For most of that time, all 4 men had lived under conditions historians can only partially reconstruct from surviving records, confined, questioned repeatedly, cut off almost entirely from the wider order whose collapse they could only have understood in fragments through whatever news filtered into their confinement. It is worth remembering gently that these were not young men enduring this ordeal. Molay himself was likely in his 60s by the time of his death, having spent the greater part of his adult life first as a soldier in the Holy Land and Cyprus, then as the order's leader through its final, difficult retreat, and finally as a prisoner in the city where he had once been received as an honoured guest at a royal funeral. 7 years is a very long time to sit in uncertainty at any age. At the end of a long, eventful life already spent largely in the service of a cause, it is longer still. Jacques de Molay spent nearly 7 years as a prisoner following his arrest in October of 1307. Years of imprisonment, repeated interrogation, and, according to his own later statements, considerable pressure to maintain the confession he had originally given under duress in those first frightening weeks. For most of that time, he appears to have complied, publicly affirming the confession that had likely saved him, in the short term, from the harsher treatment given to brothers who refused to confess at all. But in December of 1314, brought before a public assembly in Paris, alongside a small handful of the order's other most senior surviving officers, including a knight named Geoffroy de Charny, to formally and finally confirm their guilt one last time before a sentence of life imprisonment was to be pronounced. Something in the old Grand Master changed. According to the chroniclers who recorded the scene, Molay stood before the assembled crowd and, instead of confirming his confession, retracted it entirely, declaring, in the clearest terms available to him, that the order had committed no such crimes, that the charges brought against it were false, and that his own earlier admission had been given only out of fear and under pressure he had not been able to resist. Geoffroy de Charny stood beside him and did the same. It was, by any measure, an extraordinarily brave thing to do, and also, given the political reality of the moment, an extraordinarily dangerous one. A confessed heretic who had shown humility and repentance might reasonably expect a sentence of life imprisonment. A man who publicly retracted his confession before a crowd, in the eyes of the authorities gathered there, had relapsed into heresy all over again, and relapsed heretics, under the law of the time, faced a single much harsher penalty. Philip, informed of what had happened, acted with the same speed and decisiveness he had shown 7 years earlier. There is a small, curious footnote to Jacques de Molay's own story that many tellings of this history leave out, perhaps because it sits so awkwardly close to legend without quite becoming one. Several decades after his execution, a French knight bearing the very same name, Jacques de Molay, became the first reliably documented owner of a linen cloth that would go on to become one of the most famous and most debated relics in all of Christianity. The Shroud of Turin, long venerated by some as the burial cloth of Christ, and examined, argued over, and scientifically tested by generations of scholars since. Historians have long noted the shared name with real interest, and some have proposed that the later Charney may have been a nephew or other close relation of the executed Templar, though the surviving genealogical record is thin enough that no firm connection has ever been established beyond reasonable doubt. It is exactly the kind of loose thread that this whole story seems to specialize in leaving behind. Not quite a mystery, not quite a coincidence, simply one more small, unresolved question sitting quietly at the edge of a much larger one. A council was hastily gathered that same evening to consider what to do with two men who had, in the eyes of the law, just relapsed into the very heresy they had previously confessed to. There was little appetite among a king determined to close this long chapter once and for all for another lengthy process of trial and deliberation of the kind that had already dragged on for years. Without further trial, he ordered Molay and Charney executed the very next day. On the 18th of March 1314, on a small island in the Seine near the heart of Paris, a spot then known as the Îlot Juif, later absorbed into the western tip of what is today the Ile de la Cité, within sight of the great cathedral of Notre Dame itself, the two elderly knights were burned at the stake, bringing to a close, in the most public and irreversible way possible, the earthly life of the man who had led the Knights Templar through its final difficult years. I will not linger on the details of that final afternoon, because this is not, and has never been, the hour for lingering on suffering. What matters for the sake of this story is the quiet dignity chroniclers of the period attributed to Molay in his final hours, accounts describing him as calm, composed, and resolute in his final denial of the charges against him, a portrait that, whatever its precise historical accuracy, has shaped how the old Grand Master has been remembered ever since, not as a broken, confessing prisoner, but as a man who, given one last chance to speak freely, chose the harder, more dangerous truth over the safer lie. Contemporary chroniclers describe a considerable crowd gathering on the riverbank and the nearby bridges to witness the execution, drawn by curiosity, by the strange, unresolved drama the whole affair had become over 7 long years, and, for at least some among them, by a quiet, uneasy sympathy for a man whose story had by that point been public knowledge for the better part of a decade. Paris in 1314 was not a city short on public spectacle, but the execution of a man who had once dined among kings and carried a royal funeral pole left an impression that outlasted the afternoon itself, feeding directly into the persistent legends of curses and unfinished justice that would attach themselves to the story almost immediately afterward, circulating in taverns and marketplaces long before any chronicler thought to write them down. If your thoughts have wandered off somewhere softer by now, let them stay there. You don't need to follow every remaining thread of this story all the way to its end to have understood it fully. Some part of you has probably already gathered the shape of it. A beginning built from compassion, a middle built from patience and quiet competence, and an ending built from debt, fear, and the ordinary unglamorous machinery of power. That shape is really all that matters. The names and dates can drift away now, like the last of the smoke from a fire that has, in every way that counts, already gone out. It is from this same moment that one of the most enduring legends of the entire Templar story is said to have emerged. The tale, recorded only in later less reliable sources rather than in any contemporary document, that Molay, from the flames, called out a curse upon both Philip and Clement, summoning them to answer for their actions before God within the year. What makes this legend linger, whatever its actual origin, is a genuinely striking coincidence that followed it. Clement died within a matter of weeks of Molay's execution, and Philip himself, still a relatively young and healthy man by the standards of the time, died suddenly later that same year in a hunting accident. Historians today treat the curse itself as almost certainly a later embellishment, the kind of dramatic flourish chroniclers and storytellers have always been drawn to add on to a story that already contained more than enough drama of its own. But the timing of those two deaths was real, and it is easy enough to understand why medieval observers and generations of storytellers since found it difficult to resist connecting the two. There is no marked grave for Jacques de Molay, no quiet headstone anywhere that a visitor might stand before today. According to the accounts that survive, his remains, like Geoffroy de Charny's beside him, were given no formal burial at all, their ashes simply allowed to scatter into the waters of the Seine once the fire had finished its work. A final, almost complete erasure of the physical presence of a man who had once led one of the most powerful institutions in Christendom. There is something worth sitting with gently in that particular detail on a night otherwise devoted to rest. So much of how we remember the dead depends on having a place to stand quietly and think of them, and Molay was denied even that. And yet, in a way his enemies could not have anticipated, the absence of any grave seems only to have deepened how thoroughly he has been remembered instead, not through a stone marker in a churchyard, but through 7 centuries of retelling, exactly like the one you are listening to right now. With Molay's death, the Order's very last formal leadership passed into history, and what remained, in the years and centuries that followed, was no longer the Knights Templar as a living institution at all, but something else entirely, an idea, a mystery, a story that people kept quietly retelling long after every person who had actually lived it was gone. It is worth spending a little time, gently, on why that particular kind of afterlife took hold so strongly, because it says something rather lovely about how the human imagination tends to handle an ending that arrives too suddenly to feel fully explained. A slow, gradual decline rarely produces legends. Nobody tells hushed stories about institutions that simply grew old and quietly closed their doors over a generation or two. But an order that had stood, visibly and powerfully, for nearly 2 centuries, and that was then dismantled within the span of a single decade, arrested in a single coordinated morning, its leader publicly executed only 7 years later, leaves behind exactly the kind of abrupt, unresolved silence that stories tend to rush in to fill. For several centuries after Molay's death, the Templars faded, for the most part, into a fairly quiet corner of European memory, remembered mostly by specialist chroniclers and church historians, rather than the wider public. Their real return to popular imagination came much later, during the 18th and especially the 19th centuries, an era with a particular fondness for medieval romance and rediscovered mystery. Novelists of the period wove Templar characters into sweeping historical fiction set during the Crusades, helping fix the Order's white mantle and red cross firmly back into the popular imagination after centuries of relative quiet. Around the same period, a number of new fraternal and esoteric societies entirely unconnected to the medieval order in any documented continuous way began adopting Templar names, symbols, and imagined lineages for their own purposes, borrowing the romance of an old vanished order of warrior monks to lend their own newer organizations a sense of ancient, mysterious weight. It is this 19th century revival, layered on top of the genuine 700-year-old core of the story, that gave rise to much of the elaborate legend that still surrounds the Templars today, not a continuous, secret thread running unbroken from 1307 to the present, but something closer to successive generations, each finding their own reasons to pick the old story back up and add a little more to it. One of the earliest and most persistent of these stories concerns the Templar fleet said to have been docked at the port of La Rochelle on the French Atlantic coast in the days before the arrests. According to the legend, word of the coming arrests reached the Order just in time for a portion of its treasury, and perhaps a number of its brothers, to be loaded aboard ships and quietly sent to sea before Philip's men could reach the port, vanishing into the Atlantic, never to be reliably accounted for again. It is, without question, a wonderfully evocative image, a handful of ships slipping out of harbour in the pale hours before dawn, carrying away whatever could be saved of 2 centuries of accumulated purpose. It is also, historians are generally quick to note, very thinly supported by actual surviving evidence. Templar naval activity in this period was real but modest, used mainly for transporting goods and personnel between Europe and the Mediterranean, rather than for any grand secret evacuation, and no contemporary document reliably confirms a fleet escaping La Rochelle on the eve of the arrests at all. The story may contain a kernel of ordinary truth distorted gently over centuries of retelling, or it may simply be one of the many romantic elaborations that grew up naturally around a story already dramatic enough to invite them. Closely related, and just as persistent, is the legend of hidden Templar treasure, vast stores of gold, silver and sacred relics, supposedly spirited away before the Crown's officials could seize the Order's assets, and hidden ever since in locations ranging from remote castles in France to sea caves in Scotland to, in one particularly modern and thoroughly investigated version of the tale, a small forested island off the coast of Nova Scotia in Canada, where generations of treasure hunters have spent considerable fortunes searching for a Templar hoard that has never once been found. That particular search, centred on a mysterious depression in the ground long nicknamed the Money Pit, has continued in one form or another for well over 2 centuries now, drawing excavators, investors and more recently television crews, all chasing a connection to the Templars that rests on speculation and coincidence, rather than any document or artifact that historians consider genuinely convincing. The historical record suggests something rather more mundane, if you sit with it. Philip's officials did indeed seize the Paris Temple's treasury upon the arrests, and while it is entirely true that some assets and documents were likely moved or hidden by individual brothers in the panic and confusion of those first days, there is little credible evidence of any single, vast, intact treasure quietly waiting somewhere to be discovered. The legend persists not because the evidence supports it especially well, but because it is, quite simply, an irresistible story. The idea that some tangible piece of that vanished world might still be sitting, undisturbed, beneath the ground somewhere, waiting for the right person to find it. A third strand of legend, somewhat later in origin, links the Templars to the emergence of Freemasonry several centuries afterward, suggesting that surviving Templars, driven underground by the Order's suppression, quietly preserved their traditions and rituals within later fraternal organizations, eventually resurfacing as the stonemasons' guilds from which modern Freemasonry claims descent. This connection is embraced with real enthusiasm within some strands of Masonic tradition itself, and it has inspired an enormous body of popular fiction and speculation in the centuries since. Professional historians examining the actual documented origins of Freemasonry in late medieval and early modern stonemasons' guilds generally find no reliable evidence connecting the two institutions directly, and regard the link as a much later romantic invention rather than a documented historical continuity, which is not, it's worth saying gently, to dismiss the appeal of the idea itself. Only to be honest about the difference between a beautiful story and a well-documented one, a distinction history asks us to hold on to even when, perhaps especially when, the beautiful story is the one we would prefer to believe. A fourth and somewhat gentler thread of legend points towards Scotland, where, at the time of the arrests, the reigning king, Robert the Bruce, found himself in an unusual position, excommunicated by the very same papacy pursuing the Templars, and consequently somewhat outside the ordinary reach of papal authority within his own kingdom. Some later storytellers have suggested that Scotland became a quiet refuge for individual Templars fleeing arrest elsewhere in Europe, and popular tradition has long associated the order, however loosely, with Rosslyn Chapel, a richly and mysteriously carved 15th century chapel near Edinburgh, built by a family with genuine historical connections to the earlier crusading movement, though built more than a century after the Templars themselves had already been dissolved. As with the other legends we have wandered through tonight, The documentary evidence for any organised Templar refuge in Scotland is thin at best, and most historians treat the connection as a later, romantic layering of unrelated historical threads rather than a demonstrated fact. But there is something fitting, even so, in imagining a handful of frightened, ordinary men finding their way to a quiet, distant corner of Europe where the reach of the men pursuing them happened, for entirely unrelated reasons, to run a little shorter than elsewhere, whether or not it happened exactly, or at all, in the way the legend now describes it. There is one smaller, gentler piece of Templar folklore worth mentioning before we move on, if only because it touches so directly on tonight's own title. The particular combination of a Friday and the number 13 had already, quite independently of the Templars, carried a faint sense of unease in various European folk traditions long before 1307. Friday linked in Christian memory to the day of the crucifixion, and 13 carrying its own older, scattered associations with misfortune across several cultures. The idea that the Templar arrests specifically were what first fused those two threads together into the single modern superstition of Friday the 13th is, by most careful historical accounts, a connection made mostly by later writers rather than something contemporaries themselves remarked upon at the time. The earliest clear evidence of Friday the 13th as a unified, named superstition doesn't reliably appear until centuries afterward, in the 19th century, and yet it is easy enough to understand why the story stuck once it was told. A single Friday morning, a single sealed date, an entire order's fate turning on it, even without a direct documented lineage. It is exactly the kind of coincidence a good story quietly claims for itself over time, whether or not the history books can fully support the claim. What is true, and does not require any legend to make it remarkable, is this: the Knights Templar left behind, in the 2 centuries of their actual documented existence, an influence considerably larger than the 8 years of their downfall might suggest. They pioneered financial instruments and institutional trust networks that quietly anticipated elements of modern banking centuries before anything resembling a modern bank existed. They built castles whose ruins still draw travellers today, standing in the hills of modern Israel, Syria and Lebanon, weathered but recognisable, stone laid by hands that believed, however briefly, that they were building something permanent. Their round churches, most famously the one still standing in London, preserved an architectural echo of Jerusalem that has outlasted the order itself by more than 700 years. In Portugal, the great fortified convent at Tomar, once a Templar stronghold and later the seat of the Order of Christ that inherited so much of the old order's purpose and property, still stands largely intact today, its round chapel and cloisters open to quiet visitors who often have little idea, walking through its courtyards, quite how directly its stones connect back to 9 tired men in Jerusalem 9 centuries earlier, and the striking visual identity the Templars established, the white mantle, the red cross, has gone on to be adapted, referenced and reimagined in flags, insignia and popular culture right up to the present day, an image that continues to carry weight and mystery for people who otherwise know very little about the actual men who once wore it. There is a quieter, less visible legacy too, worth mentioning gently before we move toward the close of this story. The particular way Philip moved against the Templars, using debt, accusation, and the machinery of religious inquiry to dismantle a wealthy, semi-independent institution that had grown inconvenient to royal authority, did not go unnoticed by the kings who came after him. Historians studying the slow, centuries-long process by which medieval European monarchies gradually absorbed or neutralized independent religious and military institutions have long pointed to the Templar affair as an early, particularly stark example of a pattern that would recur in gentler and harsher forms again and again in the centuries that followed, as the balance of power in Europe shifted steadily away from the Church's independent institutions and toward the centralized authority of individual crowns. In that sense, the Templars' ending was not only the close of their own particular story, but a small, early chapter in a much longer, slower story about the changing shape of power in Europe altogether, one that would continue unfolding for hundreds of years after the last candle in the Paris temple had gone dark. Perhaps what lingers longest, though, has less to do with treasure or hidden fleets or secret societies, and more to do with the simple, very human shape of the story itself. An idea born from genuine compassion for frightened strangers on a dangerous road, nurtured over 2 centuries into something vast, wealthy, and permanent seeming, and then, in the space of a single generation, dismantled by the ordinary unglamorous forces of debt and royal ambition. There is something quietly consoling, even in an ending as difficult as this one, in remembering how the story actually began, not with wealth or power at all, but with a handful of tired men who simply decided that someone should stand between the vulnerable and the danger on the road, because no one else was doing it. There is, perhaps, a fair question sitting quietly underneath everything we've walked through tonight. Why a story containing arrests, forced confessions, and a man burned at the stake should belong in the same gentle category as stories meant to ease someone towards sleep at all. It is worth answering honestly, even at this late, drowsy hour. The comfort in a story like this one was never meant to come from pretending the difficult parts away. It comes instead from a kind of distance, the particular safety of knowing that everything you have just heard is already entirely over. There is nothing left to fear on behalf of these men, nothing left to hope will turn out differently, no ongoing danger your mind needs to keep quietly tracking even in the background. Their story reached its ending 700 years ago and has stayed exactly there ever since, fixed, finished, unable to surprise anyone ever again. That fixedness is its own kind of rest, oddly enough. The difference between worrying about a fire still burning and simply looking, from a great, safe distance, at the last of its smoke. If you carry only one thread forward from these 2 long hours together, let it be that quiet symmetry, a beginning and an ending built from the very same raw material. 9 tired men, sharing horses, choosing a hard, unglamorous task, simply because it needed doing. And nearly 2 centuries later, an old man in a Paris prison, given one final chance to say something easy or something true, choosing the harder path one last time, the same way his order had chosen it, in its own quiet fashion, at the very beginning. Between those 2 points stretches the entire vast, complicated middle of the story. The castles, the banking houses, the battles won and lost, the slow accumulation of wealth and suspicion alike. But the 2 ends of it rhyme with each other in a way that feels, even now, oddly moving to notice. Institutions rise and fall for all kinds of complicated reasons. It is rarer and gentler to notice that the same simple instinct that built something can also be the last thing standing when everything else about it has been stripped away. If you have made it this far tonight, well past the edges of what any single evening usually asks of you, let yourself rest now, because the story, in every way that matters, is finished. There is nothing more you need to carry forward from here. No date to remember, no name to hold on to, no final lesson you are required to take away before you can let go. Only the quiet, settling sense of having heard something old and mostly true. The way you might listen to a grandparent's story late at night, more for the comfort of the telling than for any fact it contains. Picture, if it helps, the Paris temple itself, centuries after Molay's death, its great keep eventually pulled down entirely, the stones scattered or repurposed into other, humbler buildings, the ground it once stood on absorbed quietly back into the ordinary streets of a city that had long since moved on to other concerns. There is nothing frightening in this image, only the slow, patient way that time eventually settles over everything, however grand it once seemed. Castles becoming ruins, ruins becoming hillsides, hillsides becoming simply, quietly, part of the landscape again. It happens to empires, it happens to orders of warrior monks who once seemed untouchable. It will happen, gently and without any drama at all, to every worry currently sitting somewhere in the back of your own mind tonight. Think, if you'd like, of the roads themselves, the same dry, pale roads between Jaffa and Jerusalem where this whole story first began, worn smooth now by 9 centuries of ordinary feet that have nothing to do with knights or kings at all. Farmers walk them, buses drive along modern versions of them. Children run home along stretches of ground where frightened pilgrims once wept with relief at their first sight of a distant city wall. The danger that called the order into being passed, in time, the way almost every danger eventually does, and the road simply became a road again, unremarkable, ordinary, safe enough now that almost no one walking it gives a single thought to the men who once rode beside it, watching the hills for trouble. There is something worth holding on to in that, gently, as your own eyes grow heavier. The reminder that even the most urgent, frightening chapter of any story is, in the end, still only a chapter, and that roads, like minds, like nights like this one, do eventually settle back into quiet. Let your breathing slow now, the way it wants to. Let your thoughts loosen their grip on whatever they have been holding, the way a hand slowly opens once it finally trusts that it doesn't need to hold on anymore. Somewhere in the hills of a country you may never visit, old stones are standing quietly in the dark right now, worn smooth by 9 centuries of wind, holding no more secrets than any other old wall, keeping no more watch than the silence around them requires. There is nothing left for you to guard tonight. There is nowhere else you need to ride. The road is empty, the pilgrims have long since arrived safely wherever they were going, and the only thing left to do, the only duty left in this entire long story, is to close your eyes and let it finally, fully end. There is no chapter after this one. No further gate to watch, no further ledger to balance, no further vow left unfulfilled. Whatever the mind was holding on to when this story began. A worry from earlier today, a task waiting for tomorrow, some small unfinished thought that kept circling back. Let it circle a little slower now, and a little slower still, until it simply stops circling altogether, the way a wheel eventually stops when no one is pushing it anymore. You do not have to make it stop, you only have to stop pushing. If you were to travel to those hills someday, in some ordinary future daylight, you would likely find them quieter than you expect. A handful of other visitors wandering slowly between broken walls, a guide pointing out a few worn carvings, birds nesting now in what were once watchtowers built to spot approaching danger from a mile away. Nothing about the scene would ask anything of you. No urgency would greet you there, only the patient, settled feeling of a place that finished being urgent a very long time ago. That is where this whole enormous story has ended up. In the end, not vanished, not erased, simply grown quiet, the way almost everything eventually does. Given enough centuries and enough kindness from the passing of ordinary time, let that same quietness settle over you now, here, in this room, in this bed, in whatever hour of the night has found you tonight. There is nothing more this story is asking of you. Not your attention, not your memory, not even your continued wakefulness. It was only ever meant to be company for exactly this stretch of time between one part of your day and the deeper rest waiting just beyond it. And it has, if you've made it this far, done exactly what it set out to do. Whatever tomorrow holds can wait, quite comfortably, until tomorrow actually arrives. Tonight asks nothing else of you at all. Sleep now. The candles are going out, one by one, in a fortress that no longer exists, in a city that has long since forgotten which stones once belonged to it. And you, wherever you are tonight, are already halfway somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere softer, somewhere with no gates left to guard and no roads left to ride. Rest there. You have more than earned it.